Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture, and today we're going to be talking about the sophomore album from T-Rextasy called Prehysteria. So one of my plans for 2019 was getting a little bit more freedom to venture into weird places to find new music. And given how slow things are starting off in 2019, it's a good time to build more of my nice routine in finding it. And nowhere is more overstuffed with off-kilter weirdness than Bandcamp. And talk about the sort of act that immediately becomes tricky to talk about, mostly because they defy easy categorization. So yeah, we're doing it. Let's talk about T-Rextasy, a New York-based punk group that broke out in the mid-2010s with their debut Jurassic Punk. And if by some of those names you might be thinking we're dealing with a joke act, well, I could definitely see it, but I'm not quite sure I'd entirely agree with that assessment. It's definitely true this group's got a broad, cartoonish blend of vintage garage rock and art punk, splitting the difference between twee and Riot girls so subtly you might be convinced that neither are truly applicable, and yet all deliver with a bratty yet comedic theatricality that at its best can feel really wry and clever, but at its worst can feel like the Brooklyn hipster community theater that's both grating and entirely too impressed with itself. What I'm stressing is that the sound can be very niche, especially given the thick accent of Lyris Faron, but it's certainly catchy, it's colorful, and I enjoyed their debut album enough to check out their follow-up, Prehysteria. So what do we get? Well, it's generally pretty damn good, but if you weren't won over on T-Rextasy by Jurassic Punk, I would put money on Prehysteria not coming any further to convincing you, as while their sound has expanded ever so slightly, the overall approach is still very similar. That being said, it is more consistent than Jurassic Punk, but I'm not sure there's any one song here that's got the gut punch and vicious writing of Gap Your Boys, and that means while I definitely enjoyed this album, I wouldn't quite say I loved it or would call it great in that vein. And really, we have to start the conversation with a lot of the songwriting, because that's where T-Rextasy has always stood out the most for me and will be the make or break point for a lot of the audience. And I've already mentioned Lyris Faron's thicker, not quite traceable accent, but she's also pairing it with a very theatrical style of delivery that really is the only saving grace for how twee some of the lyrics can get. As I've said in the past, twee is not really my thing. Between the goofiness of the zit song that's only a half step away from a Family Guy sketch, the overstuffed double entendre of Coffee, and the outright retreat into adolescence of Baby, to say nothing of the weird, not particularly focused, and sometimes contradictory statements on Tattoo, this is where the writing falls into the category of being more campy and garish than all that punchy or all that clever, and yet never quite over the top enough to really connect for me. And really, that's about half the album. There's only 10 songs here. Now, thankfully, the other half splits into two groups. The songs that are just pure camp, like Theme from Prehysteria, and that can kind of revel in its own self-mythologizing, no matter how silly it is, and the smarter songs that deal more in messy queer relationships and a lot of dissatisfaction. And if I'm delving into any sort of theme with this project, this is where the album can reveal a larger sense of understandable confusion between societal constraints and their own personal quirks. They're not really getting what they want, but when you combine it with the open question of how they might not know what they want in the first place, and they wind up making do along the way, there is a sense of deeply rooted millennial frustration that can definitely resonate if you can get into that mindset. And I like the mingled, unclear morass of affection between women on Girlfriend, followed up with a lot more anger underscored with insecurity on Maddy's Got a Boyfriend. And I like how these songs are juxtaposed with a real underlying sense of independence and emotional complexity, from satiating one's desire in their craft and art on Rip Van Vintage to the hipster guy who might be an entitled jackass, but she might fall for him anyway on Pretty Boy, hence why she kinda has to avoid him. And look, all the writing really has the feel of a university drama production, a little bit overwritten, a little earnest, the poetry is not quite as tight as it really should be, and honestly that kind of applies to a lot of the music too, and it's a little tough to nail down why I don't quite love this style of punk and indie rock, because while the polish did shave away some distortion and bite, the melodies are still pretty prominent, the grooves are still pretty chunky and propulsive, and T-Rextasy still pulls plenty from girl groups, a little bit of proto-punk and art punk, and even hints of ska as the horns slip onto I Don't Do Lunch and Coffee, although for being honest, some of the syncopation on songs like Rip Van Vintage highlight that ska side side in the composition too. Now, I will freely admit that when the band gets closer to raw punk on songs like Girlfriend, theme from Prehysteria, and especially Maddy's Got a Boyfriend, we really do get some of the best moments on this album, but more of that might be linked to some greater tightness and intensity that cuts like Pretty Boy, good as they might be, just don't have to the same extent with all the warped quasi-psychedelic guitars. And you know what, I'll say it, if the songs are going to sound as clean as they do, you find yourself wishing the pop side had a little bit more refinement, because otherwise they can just feel a little sloppier than they should. And while I wouldn't say really that the vocals are the whole problem, I will say they could afford to be a lot more layered and multi-tracked, if only to lend them a little bit more body and give some sticky hooks some more punch. These women all have a lot of distinctive personalities, and I kind of wish they played off each other a little bit more. And finally, I really wish this album was better sequenced. The fact that Theme from Prehysteria didn't open up the album, and yet Tattoo ended it, are both too mystifying and not particularly good decisions to set tone or momentum, or end on a strong foot. I really did not think Tattoo should have ended the album. Granted, I'm not a big fan of the song as a whole, I'm not sure it should have been on here in the first place. But as a whole, look, this is a very niche project, and I'll admit if you're not willing to get on board, I understand. It's a shade too goofy and polished to fit among the best of Riot Grrl, but also a little bit too slapdash for most indie pop in the mainstream right now. And on top of that, if you don't have a taste for a very queer, very colorful, very New York art collective, Brooklyn-centric brand of music, this will be too much, probably will not stick, maybe even a little bit obnoxious. But for me, I don't know, the theatricality always worked, the writing can be pretty insightful if you read between the lines, and there's a ton of character to this music that can't really be denied, especially with the acknowledgement that while they're not in the same leagues as the older women in indie rock like Nico Case or Sleater Kinney or the newly revived XX, they could very well get there. They've got that personality. So for me, I don't know, very light 7 out of 10. Check it out if you want something loose and fun to start out the year, and I'll definitely be curious to see what will come next. Good stuff. Check this out. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. Not a ton to say about this, but when you have a band this unique and it's got this much character behind it, I kind of wanted to put together a full review. So if you want to buy or stream the album, links down there below. And I got the poll up there for fans to tell me how wrong I am. We're dealing with a really small act here. I'm kind of curious where you guys end up falling. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you guys want to get involved in helping support this channel, link to my Patreon right over there. I'm still trying to revamp things. We're going to see how things go. But till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.